Hello my friends, and welcome back to the latest Meerkat Musings video. I'm your host Ben, and I'm speaking a little bit today about the recent announcement of a general election here in the UK. So forgive me if I am boring you with politics, but as you can imagine, an election to determine in a very real sense the future path of this country is quite a big deal to me. And I certainly have some strong views and opinions on I think how people should vote, how I think people will vote, and what I think is at stake for the country. So it won't necessarily surprise too many of you who follow this channel or follow my blog that I am very much anti-Tory. I think the Tories have proven themselves to be a bunch of self-serving parasites over the last few years. They've been in power now for 14 years, and in that time, I think the country has gotten immeasurably worse. We've had skyrocketing NHS waiting lists. People are generally speaking a lot poorer than they were. Inflation has risen far faster than wages have risen, although if you happen to be an executive or a CEO, your wages have risen considerably faster than that of the average worker. We've had raw sewage pumped into our rivers and lakes. We had the disastrous handling of the COVID pandemic. We had, of course, the Tories partying during lockdowns in a blatant disregard of their own rules, which I think also showed a tremendous contempt for the British public as well. But despite all of that, there are still a sizable number of people who will vote Tory purely out of ideology. Even people who have been damaged by the policies of this government will still vote Tory. I actually got into a little bit of an argument with someone on Twitter on this very subject, and they, among other things, made references to, for example, the invasion of Iraq that was led by, it was under the leadership of Tony Blair, who was, of course, a former Labour Prime Minister. And they said, look, Blair sent us into an illegal war and British soldiers came back in body bags, and that's far worse than other things which have been going on. Okay, granted, there's much to unpack about the invasion of Iraq and the UK government's role in that. But what this particular person failed to acknowledge, perhaps they didn't know, or perhaps they chose not to know, is that the Tories voted in favour of that invasion. Okay, they backed the government with that 100%. They were absolutely all for sending British troops to Iraq. If they had been in power, we can probably conclude on the basis of how they voted at the time, they would have done exactly the same thing. So if you are voting Tory on the basis that you don't like what Tony Blair did all the way back in 2003, more than 20 years ago now, then you're a hypocrite, because the Tories did, they would have done exactly the same thing. They voted to do the same thing. I can understand not voting Labour because of something like that, but to give your vote to the Tories, the reasoning is painfully fundamentally flawed. And then, of course, up came a bunch of economic arguments, but the reality is it's the Tories who've had 14 years to make things better for people, and it's the Tories who've had 14 years to show they can't. The country is worse off than it was, and in recent years things have only gotten worse. Okay, you can allow for certain things which are beyond the power of the government. The COVID pandemic, for example, was something that no one could predict was going to unfold. However, the responses to that were initially quite botched. In fact, in the case of both the main waves, if you like, of the pandemic, the responses were botched by the Tories as they put financial interests ahead of public health. And again, you can say the invasion of Iraq, of Ukraine by Russia, and all the energy price concerns. Again, you can't maybe account for all of that being on the head of the Tory government. Of course you can't. But again, the way in which some of that was handled, the fact that the Tories, they placed profit ahead of people once again, which is why British energy prices in the hands of private companies skyrocketed more than they did elsewhere in Europe. Again, that's the sort of thing which is very much, as far as I'm concerned, a matter of government policy. And this is where, again, we've had the situation with our creaking water infrastructure and the sewage in our rivers and lakes, which will eventually get someone killed. We've had a big problem with that. And again, that's because the Tories, they would prefer to keep these things, these vital public services, in private hands. And of course, what do private companies do? They seek to make profit first and deal with problems later, as is proven. So, there's again, you can't pin all of that on the Tories, and Lord knows that back in Blair's time, Labour privatised quite a few things themselves. But nonetheless, a lot of this, in my view at least, is something that the Tories need to be held accountable for, because a lot of this has taken place under their watch, and they've had the means to deal with it, and they haven't. They have, as they have always done, put money first, people second. The rich have gotten considerably richer, while the average person is worse off, and it's just been a shambolic state of affairs over the past 14 years, and in particular over the last 5 years, which, funny enough, coincides with when Boris Johnson won his majority. I mean, that was always going to be a mistake. Why anyone thought Boris Johnson, knowing full well what he was like and what he's still like, could be a good, effective Prime Minister, I don't know what was going through the heads of this country at the time. But now we have an opportunity to perhaps change that. But as I say, some people will still, for whatever reason, cling desperately to the Tories. The Tories are the ones who've created this mess over the last 14 years. So why on earth do we think they can be trusted to change things? Recently, we've had, Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, stand up and say, "Oh, look, the economy is starting to improve slightly." But slightly is not good enough. Okay, there's still a huge problem. The number of food banks in this country has risen dramatically over the last 14 years, which goes to show how desperate people are. That's not going to change with another 5 years of Tory leadership. To be fair, it won't necessarily change with 5 years of Labour leadership. There are misgivings about Labour, in my view. I think modern Labour doesn't necessarily do enough to differentiate itself from the Tories. But I would also say that there are signs that Labour are looking to do things a little bit differently. For example, they have talked on their, if you look at the Labour website, one of their pledges was around creating a living wage for people. Now, what form that takes is unclear. There was talk about creating a nationalised energy company, which again is a good idea and an important first step to wresting our energy away from greedy CEOs. These are encouraging, positive signs, but are Labour different enough to the Tories overall for things to fundamentally change? I don't know. But I think one of the key things for me with this election is quite simply to get the Tories out of power, because they've proven that this bunch of Tories have proven that they are not capable of being leaders. They are not capable of governing the country. Just look at how many prime ministers you've had over the last few years where the Tories have imploded again and again. They've just been awful, absolutely awful, and they need to go. Now, that's, I think, the number one way in which the country can at least begin to have a chance. And we get them out, we get someone else in, probably Labour. They're the most realistic chance of ousting the Tories. And maybe from there, people at grassroots level with Labour can perhaps start to exert some form of influence and pressure that means Labour become a party of genuine change from existing policies and ideas. It's not going to happen overnight. Even if Labour win the election with a comfortable majority, they can't snap their fingers and change everything for the better. It doesn't work that way. But I genuinely think that they are the better of the two evils. Which is an unfortunate state of affairs, isn't it, in some respects? I mean, we should be truly optimistic about a Labour government compared to a Tory one, but it's difficult to feel that way. But nonetheless, I will vote Labour at the next election because the Tories won't be removed from power by, say, for example, the Liberal Democrats. As much as I think the Lib Dems could be a party to get behind, they're not going to win it. The Green Party have a number of positive pledges in the manifesto, but unfortunately they have nowhere near the momentum to take power. You've got the likes of Reform, but they will never get my vote because quite simply they're simply the party where hardliners from the Tories wind up. And the Tories are already pretty nuts on certain things, but then, they're not nuts enough, it would seem, for some, and those MPs go to Reform. And I will never bring myself to vote for Reform because I just think they're vile. So they're not going to get into power anytime soon, I think. Reform, however, could be one of the key factors behind why the Tories struggle. And the reason for this is that the Tories and Reform, they're kind of after the same support base in terms of voters, and Reform could steal votes from the Tories, which in turn, of course, will mean it's easier for someone else to take those seats. But because Reform probably won't directly take seats from the Tories, but they will pave the way, ironically perhaps in many respects, for Labour, for example, to take some Tory seats, or the Lib Dems to take some Tory seats. So Reform could actually help ensure a form of government that moves further away from what Reform actually want, which is kind of ironic and poetic and quite funny, but that hasn't stopped the Reform Party from gunning for the Tories quite vigorously. But, if the political right of this country, which I think has been pretty poor for the country over the last few years, wants to implode, then they are absolutely positively more than welcome to. And I will quite happily sit back with a cold beer and watch the hysterics and the whinging and the hand-wringing as they do so. So that's kind of where I'm at with all of this, really. As I say, I'll be voting for Labour despite my misgivings, and I think whatever happens, we need a fresh start. One thing the country cannot have is another 5 years of this bunch of Tories staggering from one crisis to another, one internal power struggle to another, and expecting the country to somehow be on a better footing. Ideally, what I would love to see is in a few years' time, for Labour, for example, to have an honest discussion around Brexit and suggest that perhaps we need to look at rejoining the EU. I don't know if that's going to happen because Brexit proved to be, of course, a highly polarising matter at the time, and it still is in many respects. But if they were brave and if they had enough support, maybe they could actually start to set the wheels in motion for us to return. That's, as I say, it's unlikely. It's a pipe dream. On the other hand, I think public support for the idea has grown considerably. So who knows how that might pan out. Anyway, that's basically everything that I have to say on the subject of the election at this time. It will take place on the 4th of July, which is kind of poetic in some respects, of course, as well. 4th of July famously being the USA's Independence Day, and it could be the UK's Independence Day from the Tories. We can only